What is going on, everybody? My name is Tim Jedrick. I am here with Right Rudder Marketing. Today is our podcast episode, and we have a very special guest today. I've met her many times throughout the years, going to aviation events, and she has quite the reputation. I won't give her the full intro; let her kind of speak on her own behalf. But this is Mary Schu, designated pilot examiner, really great friend of ours. And yeah, how about you give us a quick intro of who you are and what you do?
Well, good afternoon, Tim. It's great to see you. And as I mentioned to you earlier, this is my very first podcast. So if I'm out of the frame or whatever, you just push me back in, okay?
You're doing really well. You got the app loaded up and stuff. I think you're doing a great job. They did some updates on the platform here, so I can't see as much as I used to. I used to be able to see other audience members and everything.
Okay.
There is some housekeeping stuff, so if there is anyone watching live, just if you're there on YouTube or Facebook or LinkedIn, drop a comment. You can also check in. I think there's a link to the direct Riverside link that has, if you join our chat here, you'd be able to ask questions directly. If not, we'll have some room in the end of the episode for questions. If you don't have any questions, we'll end. But yeah, just go ahead, and if you have a question, type it in the chat, then we can get you on here. So I guess going back to Mary Schu again, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got to where you are.
Okay, well, this has been a long journey. This is actually my 50th year of flying. And so that's, when you look back over that and you start counting in decades, that's kind of a terrifying thing. But so far, so good. Still here and still allowed to do this by the FAA. So I got started in this because I wanted to go fast. And I used to be a truck driver on the family farm, and I wanted to be a race car driver. I wanted to be a Formula One driver. And back in those days, that was probably about as possible as seeing the elephants fly by. But it just wasn't something that anyone thought that someone who looked like me should be doing. And so I ended up kind of by default becoming a school teacher. And so I am a special education teacher by trade. I have a master's in education, and I have to say that in my career change to aviation, being a special education teacher and going into flight training was a really helpful thing because all of us have some of that, shall we call it, some kind of a challenge that we overcome, no matter who we are. And
Yeah,
so it's
definitely.
been helpful working with people. And currently I'm primarily a pilot examiner, and I travel all over the country and try to help people get their tests done before they waited for 2 months or longer, because I was a flight school owner myself. I had a 141 school, and I understand the importance of timely tests and trying to stay current and trying to, be fresh and not spending $1 bazillion while you wait. So that's a lot of what I do now. But my past has been, if you can think of it in general aviation, I have probably done it.
Wow.
Yeah. The only thing I really have not done is fly for the airline. And back in the days when I wanted to do that, which was one of my primary goals back in the 70s, I was told that I was too old and I was too short. And
Yeah.
yeah, I was 27 at the time, which seemed like that was not too old, but and it was a great way to screen people like me.
Yeah.
And interestingly, when I was then in my 50s, I was no longer too old or too short, and I was being recruited by some of the majors. So it's all about your timing in life.
Yeah.
And right now we have a shortage, and right now there are great opportunities. Back in those days, there weren't, and it's a very cyclic industry.
Yeah.
Every 5 to 7 years, something major occurs and there's a swing in the other direction. And so, when it's at its lowest, is a great time to be training because
Definitely.
it will come back and then it will be going to its highest again. So it's kind of
Exactly
like the
right.
stock market, perhaps.
There's been a lot of that in the news recently, right?
Yeah.
I've been eyeing my IRAs and 401ks like pretty closely. One day I'm losing tens of thousands of dollars. Another day I just got it back, and I'm like, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
The same
Well,
thing with the aviation market. It goes up and down, and like kind of I do agree. The best time to train was yesterday. At the end of the day, it's you still got to build hours. You still got to build experience. The more experience you have, once you're in, you're in. I mean, and you just keep building your hours, your experience. That way, if you are trying to go to the airlines, or I know a lot of our listeners, a lot of our listeners are flight school owners, but then their audience members or their customers are prospective students that, these days a lot of them are eyeing for the airlines. That's what their kind of goal is. And
Right.
we try to tell our customers that, hey, the best time to train is now, because it does take, a year. If you do it full time, it still takes about a year, 2 years to get, your ratings and certificates. Then you still got to build another year, 2 years. And we can talk about this too, how, like, is this probably the best method of training the newer pilots and rushing them through? I know that's been a hot discussion topic in the aviation industry, because, there is those accelerated programs out there, which is kind of I don't want to say questionable, but it's changing the culture, I want to say, of aviation in general. So talking about that though, so you mentioned that you've been in the industry for 50 years, so more than a decade, almost half a century.
God, don't say it like that.
Well,
Woohoo!
so as you've witnessed the evolution of our industry, walk us through a little bit about what it was back then and how it's evolved into its current state. You mentioned back then there might have been, based on who you were, whether your background, your height, your age, maybe your gender, there might have been some certain stereotypes about let's say women in aviation or something like that, that you might have had challenges back then, and now there's newer challenges today. So walk us through some of the evolution of the aviation industry and how it's impacted your journey, and some advice you can give to aspiring pilots and current pilots in the industry right now.
Well, it has changed quite a bit. When I started, some things haven't changed a lot, and that, you mentioned the gender thing. And I think, well, I was one of the first women to ever get an opportunity to have a type rating in a jet back in the 70s. And on the radio, you never heard a voice like mine, maybe once a month. It was pretty slim pickings for other than men doing this. What it amounted to was I had people who gave me a chance. Not everybody gets a chance. Some people are eliminated right off the bat. And in the generation that I was in, that happened a lot. I would see women, that were then in their 50s later, and they would say, oh, yeah, I wanted to learn how to fly. And I went to the airport and I went to do a demo flight, and we went out of this airplane, and I was really excited. And then all of a sudden, we were doing this, I think it was a power on stall. And then all of a sudden we were in a spin, looking at the ground from a really weird angle, and it really scared me to death. And I thought that was one way to screen people, because most of those people, those women, did not continue, which, if somebody had done that to me, I would probably be doing something other than talking to you today about airplanes, and so there was some of that in terms of who should be doing this. And so I had the opportunity in the Northwest part of the country to have people who believed that I could do this, who gave me a chance to do this, and who were, motivating and encouraging. And I started flight training. My playground where I was teaching school and had my special education class was about 4 miles from the airport. And our playground was on the crosswind from departure. So we saw airplanes all day, and I kept watching them thinking, I could go fast in that if I can't go fast in a race car. And so I went to the airport one night and signed up. And I knew absolutely nothing about it. And I just got lucky and walked into a 141 Cessna Pilot Center, because it was close. And so I signed up, and they said, well, would you like to do the demo flight? And I said, what's that? That's how little I knew. And they said, well, you get to go fly the airplane. Oh, cool. That'd be great. Well, did you want to wait and buy your books after that? Oh, no, I'm going to do this. That'd be fun to do, though. Anyway, so I was 50 feet off the ground. My life changed. And I decided right then I had to figure out how to do that for a living. And I was fortunate enough to get an instructor who was great. And that's some of the difference now. I see great instructors now, but their goal is not to instruct. Their goal is to go to the airline, and that's fine. But the depth of instructing that you get from doing it longer and from perhaps doing some charter or other things with it to get more experience, that's just not there now. And so you have a lot of teaching by people who haven't been anywhere and done anything. And yeah, that's part of the deal, but I'm seeing it cut back even further by some of the programs. It's about the money. It's about keeping it as short as possible. It's about going to the same locations over and over and over for cross country. that it would bore anybody to death. And there's not a lot of fun in it. There's not a lot of experience in it. And when I talk to people and ask, what's the coolest thing you've done in aviation in your training? It's not go to Modesto 100 times. It's I got to go somewhere and see an airplane at night. I was on final at a big airport. There were pretty lights, and there I was in my CRJ next to me, or
Yeah.
there I was. And there were two fighters next to me. We were all landing, and I mean, they remember that the rest of their lives, and it sure beats a trip to Modesto again. Not that Modesto is a bad place, but part of this is getting out of town, and a lot of these
Mhm.
people, when they actually get a chance to do some cross country, are so excited about it, and trying it themselves. And then I asked, did you make any mistakes? Did you make any good mistakes? Oh yeah, I made some really good mistakes. Man, oh man. Well, did you learn anything from it? Yeah, I really learned something from it. I said, super.
Yeah.
And you came home alive, right? We can use the airplane again? Well, yeah, good for you. That's exactly what should happen. We need to go make mistakes, and we're not going out and making mistakes. We are so limited and so support. Well, we're getting to the point where we are so totally dependent on somebody else being in an airplane with us that the idea of being PIC is terrifying to people, and that's too bad because that's the fun part, and
Okay.
that's part of
Yeah.
what I'm seeing in the industry is we're not appreciating what that means, that experience. And as we go down the path here, we get more and more people who are moving through faster and faster. We're going to be sitting behind people who are in the cockpit, who, between the two of them, might have a total of under 5 hours of PIC cross country in all of their training. And you can do that in a 141 school. And they have only been to like 3 or 4 airports, and only maybe 1 or 2 by themselves. And with the idea that now we can do pilots doing duties as pilot in command, and all the commercial stuff is now not sole occupant, it is with your flight instructor. It's really unfortunate, in my opinion, how the abilities and the confidence of the people coming out is limited. And they have the potential, certainly. They just haven't been given the privilege and the encouragement and been turned loose to go somewhere. Make
Hmm.
some good mistakes so they don't make the bad mistakes when I'm on board in the back, And
Yeah.
it's the people that were teaching back in the older days were there because they liked it. There were no airlines to go to, nobody was hiring. So you either went to a charter job if you got lucky, or somebody willed you one. There weren't that many of those, or you stayed on as a flight instructor. And so the ones that were there were career flight instructors for the most part. And that was the guy I had, Jim. And I look back on the things he taught me, and it was just absolutely amazing. And he had his hand in my back, and we started with my private. And well, I finished all of my ratings and started teaching flying in 15 months. And I worked full time as a school teacher. So, it was a
Awesome.
fast track, but one of those summers when I was off from teaching, I did a 40-hour cross country by myself in a 172, and I went all over the Southwest and into Moab, Utah for a raft trip. Did I make mistakes? I made a 727 go around in Salt Lake City, and I didn't even know it.
No, no.
The guy, when we got in the van to drive to the hotel, said, "Were you in that 172 that landed?" And I'm thinking, uh-oh. I don't know if I want to answer that. He says, "Did you know you made a 727 go around?" And I'm thinking, yeah, I heard some stuff happening when I got on the ground, but I was so excited to be there. I just wasn't paying attention. And ATC didn't say anything to me, so it was all good.
Yeah.
But yeah, I made some really dandy mistakes, but I learned from them, and I haven't done most of them since.
That's a big part of it, and that was what actually Tammy, she was on an episode a while ago. She does mental preparedness training, but she was a fighter jet pilot. And she talks about, the post briefing, and also the mistakes, you want to capture the mistakes ahead of time, so that they have small mistakes, because you don't want it to build up into anything big mistakes, because the bigger the mistake is, it could lead to death. And aviation is not forgiving. If you make a critical mistake, I mean, that's kind of the unfortunate. It's not, you can pull over on the side of the road and like get going. It's hey,
I
are
used
you
to wish for that.
you can glide down, and then you better hope for the best. But if you're on a night cross country, you better be looking at that black spot, hope it's not a tree and it's a piece of farmland instead.
No, you've been there too, have you?
I've been there. I've done the night cross country by myself, and I'm looking at the ground. I'm like, okay, because every 5 minutes, I'm always looking for another like emergency, landing, because that's what my instructor told me. It's like at all times, especially in cross country, just keep looking out for, hey, if my engine was to quit right now, where am I landing this plane? And at nighttime, it's just a lot more challenging. Definitely, that is an interesting take on the current industry right now. I think there is a lot of people that are on this accelerated path, and they have not done, the solo cross countries to the point where, they have all these experiences that are garnered from doing the solo cross countries. And it's funny that the weekend flyers and the hobby flyers like myself now, I was also trying to go in the airlines, but, we have done more cross country time than, let's say, our CFIs. It's just kind of crazy.
Yes. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. And you probably had a whole lot more fun too.
Oh yeah. Well, one of the things I enjoyed when I was first training was, we call it pattern purgatory. So it's when you're first starting learning how to land, and I got sick of it, to be honest. You're in the same airport. We're at St. Charles downtown or St. Charles Airport. And we've been flying this pattern like for 3 weeks straight. I can't get my landings in. Finally, my instructor said, "Hey, let's change it up a little bit." So we didn't do a full cross country, but we did a mini cross country down to the next airport. Got to see a different environment. I was flying an untowered field. That was a towered field, so I had to talk to ATC to get my my pattern work in. And adding variety is something that I think that a lot of CFIs and students can do to kind of help push them along the journey, and not stay in that pattern purgatory hell forever, but add variety to it. You can still do the pattern work, but you can also change the airport. You don't have to. You don't have. You're not locked in one airport. I mean, so.
And I couldn't agree more with that, and what I found over the years is if I'm not having fun as a flight instructor, nobody's having fun. And so I need to make it fun for me, or I can't do it. You know,
Right.
you burn out if you're not making it fun and going different places and, getting out of the airplane when you get there. I've seen students that have never been out of the airplane at a destination during their training. They've
They know how
never
to fuel. They don't know how to fuel the
don't know
plane.
how to fuel it, don't know, what an FBO is. I mean, it's like, really? One poor guy knew so little that he actually sat in the airplane waiting for someone to invite him to get out, I guess. And, he was an international student and he'd never been anywhere, but they sent him somewhere where they expected him to go in and get fuel and so on. And he sat in the airplane and it was like 100 degrees that day. And when he finally got out, he about fell on the ground and people were really worried about him, and it's like,
I should have laughed at that. I'm
what?
sorry.
And that's a true story,
Yeah.
and it's really unfortunate that we don't have an extra 20 minutes to get out of the airplane, go inside somewhere, get a drink of water, use the restroom, and then get back in and learn how to do that whole process. Because generally, when you're flying somewhere, you land and get out. But that's kind of the point.
If it wasn't for the cross countries, I wouldn't know how to fuel a plane, because I trained at the schools. And I train at another school where like we have to fuel the plane ourselves
Mhm.
sometimes. But I was, for the first 40, 50 hours of my training, there was always a ramp guy that came out. It wasn't until I started traveling and going to, say, to Kansas City or Chicago or Memphis, where I realized that airports are not the same. Like, some airports you got to do it yourself. Some airports have the guy doing the lights and everything. Not all airports are created equal, and you have to, as a pilot, you need gas to get back, so you gotta do it yourself.
And
I want to kind of
that's a
pivot,
skill in itself.
putting gas in the plane.
Well, yeah, grounding it and running the credit card machine's the hard part,
Well,
right?
that's the hardest part, because then your wallet starts hurting.
Well,
I
there's
want
that.
to take a small pivot here. So we talked a little bit about kind of the challenges we have in the industry, about some of the newer CFIs, some of the newer, I guess, pilots that are graduating through these accelerated programs. But we kind of skipped ahead. So I know you have a good, interesting lens as a DPE, but then you kind of went from a CFI. So you were at the you were a teacher. You saw the planes fly. You went to the nearest airport. You got your ratings, certificates and ratings. You became an instructor. How did you go from instructor to 141 school owner to, having basically everything in the GA world under your belt, and then DPE. Like, what's the rest of
How
the
did
story
that
that kind of
happen, huh?
yeah? What's the
Okay.
rest of the story that kind of took you there?
Well, after I finished my training, I took a cut in pay by a third to become a flight instructor, which some people questioned that choice, from a teacher. But I really loved aviation. I still do. I have never regretted my choice. And I started teaching people how to fly, which was really fun. And it was during the VA years where after Vietnam, everybody had a VA loan of X number of dollars that they needed to spend within X amount of time. And so we were really busy. However, when I finished my training, thinking that I would go to work for the same school I had been training at for 15 months, I was not asked to become a flight instructor. And I said, yeah, but I got my certificate. They said, well, we're going to offer you the opportunity to sell flight training. And
Like
I
my job.
said, so what does that mean? Well, we're going to give you an office and you wear a dress when you come to work and you can sometimes take people out on demo flights. And that was it. And I said, are you kidding? Oh, you really think I went through all this to fly once a month and sell flight training? And well, if they thought it would be a good fit, and I said, well, I appreciate that, but I'm not doing that. I'm going to go actually fly an airplane for a living, and so I told them I would be headed down the other end of the airport to blue skies and fly for them. And within a short period of time, I had a job working there, so that changed. But it was really interesting how they saw me in a role at the flight school, but not as a pilot. And I was not allowed to go on charter flights with a man if it was an overnight trip. And it's like, man, what do you guys think of me? But eventually, I finished a lot. I did a lot of flight training. I got my multi-engine rating finally. It was the charter airplane, so every time I scheduled it, it got marked off, and somebody took it on a charter. And it was a brand new 310, that's what we did our training in. 250 horse critical engine, hippity hopping 310, which was a fast, hot little number, and that was great fun. And not long after that, as it works in aviation, as we all know, there was a networking thing where a friend of mine got hired in California flying a 421. And he then hired another guy from the company who went to be the co-pilot. Well, then the first guy decided he had a better job doing something else. No, I guess the first job was there. They bought a jet. They bought a very old jet that was fairly inexpensive because it was a Jet Commander, which the range on a Jet Commander is 2.5 hours from takeoff to the ground. So you could fly it for 2 hours, but you could fly at 520 miles an hour, so you could move it on down the road. But it was a very fuel critical airplane, so I learned a great deal about planning and emergencies and things like that. And when the first guy left to go, he actually went to fly for Ross Perot, which wasn't a bad gig down the road a ways. And I was then hired. Well, I was then offered the job to become the co-pilot on the jet. And I turned it down 3 times. And my reasoning was, I know nothing about a jet. I'll get you killed. Why would you think? What was said to me was, it's much easier than you think. It's just an airplane. And I'm just still thinking, find somebody with some experience. Well, they kept saying things like, well, pay your moving expenses to come to California. And it was winter and I was really sick of rain. So they said, just come and fly it. See what you think. And so I met them in Texas, and we took off out of Fort Worth, and we had to pull the power back so we didn't exceed pattern altitude or the speed limit in the pattern. I was hooked like a big trout immediately. It's like, oh, this is great. And I have to say that on every trip, I would land probably 20 minutes after everybody else arrived because I was so far behind the airplane. But eventually I caught up. And I could get through the 7 checklists from cruise to landing. We were moving pretty fast too in that airplane. And eventually we traded seats. So I was flying left seat half the time too. And big learning curve, And what it taught me is that it doesn't really matter what the airplane is, even instructing in a complex for a private. It's what you're used to. It's what you're trained well in, and you just go with it. And I've had the opportunity toward the end of all this, that got into corporate, which led to all sorts of corporate things. And as with all things in aviation, those get sold, and then you find out later you don't have a job, so you always want to be looking for one,
Yeah.
while you're doing it. And so that happened. But then I found another job. I ended up in the Midwest, and so was there for a few years. And then one of the better jobs I had there was flying for a university there. And I did that for 5 years. They had a Cessna 421, and I flew for the university for 5 years. I flew the coaches, I flew the athletic department, I flew the president and the family, I mean, anybody that wanted to go on that airplane, I flew. And I was single pilot IFR, all kinds of weather.
Oh, single pilot IFR.
Oh
That's
yeah,
fun.
that was the first hard job I had. Yeah,
That's
that one
horrible.
will bring a tear to your eye. Especially in the Midwest, I learned what weather was.
Oh
California doesn't have any,
yeah.
you
You gotta
know.
fly where I fly it.
Yeah, I
It's
got to
fun.
see
It's
what
not
you get
bad.
to see every morning and noon and evening, and yeah, and I had a lot of emergencies. I mean, a lot of emergencies, and I'm fortunate enough to live through them. I am well trained,
Mhm.
and part of my movement toward all that was I taught at flight safety for a while, and there I really learned things. I learned a whole lot from teaching at flight safety, and for my $12 an hour, I should have paid them, but whatever. And I taught instrument multi-engine refresher courses on the weekends, and people came in that owned airplanes or had owner pilots with them or worked for DEA or whatever as contract or corporate pilots, and got them buffed up on their multi-engine instrument procedures so I could sit and push all the buttons on the simulator and cause all sorts of emergencies and accidents. Well, not accidents, but fires and potential accidents, but they all came through, right? And the goal was, when you got through, you counted the number of salt rings you'd created under their arms, and then if they were still speaking to you, it was a good session. And so most of them were. It was one of those deals. But that probably did more for me in terms of instrument training than anything else I've ever done, because we sat in the back of a simulator and vectored people with basically an ADF and an RMI and a VOR and a DME. That was it. There was no GPS or anything in those days. So it was a great way to get situational awareness figured out, which was one of my weaker points. And I'm always grateful for learning those kinds of things. And they taught me another thing, and that was surprises in airplanes are not good things. You should brief everything. And so our training was that we would brief everything we were going to do prior to having it happen, even the simulators. I follow that still. We brief everything that I'm planning to do, especially in a multi-engine, because what could possibly go wrong there? But Kansas State was where I worked, and that was 5 years. And then what happened after that? I moved back to Oregon. So I moved from the Midwest west back to the Northwest, and I had two young daughters, and I was a single mom by then. And so I had two choices when I left. It was either I thought about going to work for a major airline. By then they would hire me. I must have grown, you know, but I had to have a 737 type rating, or I could get a citation type rating. I had some severance pay and do more corporate. And so with my two children, I decided that giving them the life they needed, and I would, fly corporate or owner pilot or do things in the Northwest where I could use a citation type. I did that. And I ended up leaving flight training and having a job with a major tire company on the West Coast. And I had a job before I left flight training, which is, again, it's all connections. The
Mhm.
manager knew the chief pilot who'd just been there. And by the time I got home, I had an interview and a job. Ever since I left the Midwest, I have worked for myself. I like working for myself because I like my boss most days. And that's me.
Yeah.
But I operate best that way. So I have either had other businesses that I've started, or I've worked as a contract pilot for people and not as an employee. And that has worked out well for me, because then I could be the room mother and go on the field trip with my kids and not get fired,
Yeah.
because I
Definitely.
just wasn't available that day. So I went through the corporate route. I still do some of that occasionally, which is a lot of fun to get in a jet and do that. And a lot of owner pilots that had companies and airplanes, and they had a a lot of money in an airplane, but they weren't terribly well qualified, perhaps, in terms of hours, and the insurance company required them to have a higher time person on board. And so I did a fair amount of that, which was, that's a specialty too. There's a lot of ego involved in that one, and you have to be careful how you address things that could go terribly wrong, and address them in a way that
Yeah. There's
everybody's
some
happy and we all
finesse in
live,
there. Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, and then the way I got into the rest of it was people started coming to me to ask me to teach them how to fly while I was doing corporate in Oregon. And more and more people started asking me if I would do that. And I started developing flight students, and there were not a lot of instructors around with much experience where I was living, Central Oregon. So I started doing that, and it grew and it grew. And then the corporate things started drying up, and the students kept coming. And eventually, the airplanes that I was borrowing from other people to do flight training in disappeared. And so I didn't have an airplane anymore, but I had these students, right? And so I decided, well, maybe I could buy an airplane, which was terrifying. And I ended up becoming a Cessna Pilot Center. And that's how I started. We had one room that was about the size of a very small closet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that
Yeah,
was my
I've seen those
simulant.
operations before.
Great stuff. Yeah, no bathrooms, and most of the briefing happened on the picnic table outside, as long as it wasn't too cold or too windy. And so that was my beginning. And from there, my flight school grew, and I ended up with I wrote a 141 program, and we had 5 new Cessnas and a retractable Cutlass, and we ended up with a twin that was leased. And I wrote a 135 program. We had that. I did a lot of flying for the Forest Service, and I did fire patrol. So in the summertime, we'd go out and look for burning trees at 1,000 feet over forests. And when you were talking about, your instructor said, keep looking for places to land. Boy, that was my entire day. Which trees would be the easiest to hit if I lose my engine here? Boy, oh boy. So we did Forest Service primarily, did some charter, which is kind of tough in Oregon in the winter, and a single engine airplane, and a lot more flight school people came, and we ended up with a 145 maintenance program as well. I had a flight school. I had my own testing center, and we connected with Utah Valley State College and had a program with Delta and SkyWest that would allow my students to go into their initial airline regional training as soon as they finished. So they finished my program, went to their program, came back and instructed for a year, and then they went on. And so a lot of those guys have good jobs and are captains at various places now. And so that worked well. And in those days, we had something called student loans.
Oh, we still have that today too.
Yeah, this was through the banks, and this was like through Key Bank, and all the banks have that, and Sally Mae was another one that had, of course, the loans, which we still do too. The career students came, and they were full time all day, and we were able to 6 weeks for the private, 2 months for the commercial. Well, let's see, no, 6 weeks for the instrument, 2 months for the commercial, and then they went on for their multi in Florida, and then they came back as instructors and flew. And so it was a fast paced program. When people say, well, yeah, these are happening too fast and blah blah blah. Well, it depends on how well you do it. And my 141 program, and I'm not a boastful person, but we had a 98% pass rate, which is possible, And so the students that were there had 3 hours of ground school in the morning. They had their own flight first, and then they traded with their partner, and then they watched that person's flight. So every day they had two lessons, one to watch and one to do. And it's much easier to sit in the back and watch somebody else screw up, what you might have done too. But they did well. And I didn't do the exams. We had someone else who did their exams. And so they were my quality control on it. But I did the final checks. And if they got through me to get to one, then nobody failed. Knock on wood, And so it was fast paced, but the expectation was that you went home and studied. And we used King's School programs, and it was online and it was computerized. That was the beginning of that. And it was, the Cessna Pilot Center programs had turned into King's School, which was great. And so John and Martha, taught them, and they had to, go through the lesson. They had to watch the video. They had to then come in, do the lesson, and we filled out the paperwork. It was a good program, and I cannot thank John and Martha enough, and Cessna, of course, for the success of that and how well those people did. And they were solid, and they were, they had been places. I love it. Well, I don't love it. I really don't love it at all. I ask when I do a CFI initial. So, when you're a flight instructor, will you be able to send your student to a destination where you have not taken them already for their solo cross country? And the answer I get is no. And then I ask, well, where is that written? Show me where that's written that you can't do that. And then we begin leafing through.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, it is not written. And the idea that someone would actually do that is just astounding to them, which tells me that there's a whole lot of there's a whole lot of stuff we got to be doing a little better, and that's one of it, like we talked about earlier. But the school was successful. The 135 was, as successful as it could be. The 145 repair station was how I learned a great deal about maintenance. Some of it, maybe I didn't want to know, but it was all good. And then we had the crash and banks.
Oh, so this is like around 2008 now, I'm thinking?
It was 2008. We started getting notices. We're calling those loans, And by 2010, nobody had a loan. You could get a loan through one of the companies if you had 2 cosigners with 800 credit, and the interest rate was 24%.
Jeez. That's
Oh,
horrible.
it was just getting.
It's first hard to get, but that's also a horrible rate too. So
Yeah, and so what was really horrible was we had grandparents who were second mortgaging their houses for this, and it was
the
like,
HELOC loan. Yeah, I've heard of people doing those, like home equity loans.
yeah,
I've seen that. That's currently happening right now in the industry, even to 2025. I know we've gone the timeline from the 1970s to 2000s already now, but it's still an issue today. It's like, I'm hearing this financing stuff is still like a big part of.
Yeah,
it's definitely in the mind
problem.
of student pilots. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when that happened, we just, everybody used up their money, and that was it. And so at that point, I didn't have much to do. I had been redesignated as an examiner. I had been an examiner in the Midwest out of Wichita. But when you moved in those days, it didn't follow you, and you had to reapply. And there was really not a need in Oregon. The guy we had was great. And I was doing other stuff, so it was fine. I didn't worry about it. But then our flight school was pretty busy, and it was so busy, in fact, that our control tower controllers got a whole pay grade raise due to activity.
Good.
It was
stimulating the economy over here.
Excellent. Yeah, until the banks crashed, and they were, how did that go? They were too big to fail, and I wasn't.
we did quantitative easing with them, and they got bailed out. So
Yeah.
supposedly.
So anyway, at that point, I went to the valley, went across the mountains to Portland to be a DPE because I was trying to keep the flight school afloat while working, to make enough money to do that, and eventually it just couldn't happen. But that's how I started back into being a DPE, and since then I do flight instructing. I personally enjoy flight instructing maybe more than being a DPE, and part of that is because I can be more of a part of the solution.
Yeah, well, you're part of the final process, so you're still part of the solution, just not the product building part, I guess. Shaping the student and their habits. It's more so checking to make sure that the habits are correct and the procedures are correct.
But it's not as much fun as when I was able to do that, because now I have to keep my mouth shut, sit in my hands, and the news is not always as good as I'd like.
No.
And that really bothers me. So when I go places to work with people, I try to sit down with whoever will come and see me and talk about where we're at and what's good and what needs to be improved. And most of the places I go are anxious to have that kind of input. And the FAA requires that we do pre and post briefings. But some places I go, I don't ever see an instructor, which is, a problem, because then I have to sit and type stuff up because I have to communicate with them. But The schools, a lot of the schools that I work with are doing a great job. And in fact, I'm on location here today
No,
in
yeah.
beautiful Concord, California. And, been a good week so far. But it's about the attitude of management. Their primary reason for being in business is certainly part of this. With the students, I try to find out their motivation for doing this, and probably 9 out of 10, I hear I'm going to the airline. And then I ask the question of why? Why have you chosen the airline? Great choice, but why? And when I hear you've got cool uniforms and I'm going to make a lot of money,
Yeah.
I'm thinking, you might want to look further into this. My concern for the people that are doing this now is lack of information about what this really is. This is hard. If you're going to be in aviation as a professional pilot, this is hard. It's shift work in terms of hours. It's across time zones. And if you're not working for a 121 where you're having your hours, at least 8 hours limitation, if you're doing corporate, there is no limitation. And so you could be, worked into the ground if you're not careful. And I hear too from people that are at the airline level that they say that a lot of the students there'll be a lot of washout. It'll happen in the classes, or it will happen in the first couple of years. And I say, well, my gosh, after you made it through 2 years, isn't that a guaranteed deal? Isn't everything rosy? And they say, well, they don't understand what this is. They don't understand that there's bidding and there's furlough and there's wait time and there's this and there's that. And I said, well, why aren't you guys going out there teaching it? He says, well, we do some of that, but we're hoping that the flight schools might explain where this was going. And so it concerns me when people are spending over $100,000 for this training to find out that it really wasn't their cup of tea after all, that the uniform gets dirty and, yeah, there's money, but there's other ways to make money and more money than this. You have to love this. And if you don't love this, it's just way too hard. And so,
I'm in the same boat. If I didn't love aviation, I'd probably not be doing this. So it's hard work. It's hard even from promoting perspective, our agency perspective, marketing stuff. If I don't love aviation, then why am I even doing this? And I think that's something that we asked our flight school owners, their students, their CFIs. Like, I think this is an industry of passion, right? So it's quite the journey. We went all the way from the 70s to kind of current, being the examiner. I had prepared a decent amount of questions ahead of time, and some of the audience members did come up with some questions in between of
okay.
our story here. So one of the first questions that are here were, let's go back to the exam. I think a lot of people that are listening, whether they're a aspiring pilot / student, or they're a flight school owner with many students and they're trying to push them through the Checkride. Let's go to the actual pilot exam, the Checkride. What are why besides motivation, that might be part of it. If they're motivated to fly airlines for pretty uniforms and high pay, but there's not really the passion there, that could be a potential fail reason. That's kind of the root cause. But there's obviously some other stuff in the front end that might be causing them to not be successful in a Checkride, whether it's unpreparedness, maybe not filling the IACRA form out right. I'm just on top of my head. From the DPE perspective, you see this every day. What are some common reasons that people don't make it through the Checkride, and how can we tackle that as flight school owners to help our students out?
That is such a great question. And there's so many tentacles to that. It's not one thing. And a lot of people say, well, I can't get a check right, so I'm waiting too long because there aren't enough examiners. And yeah, that is one factor that's part of this. But yeah, there are a lot of reasons why check rides don't go well. And paperwork is certainly one of them, and when people come and I've started sending out forms that explain what and where and please add your logbook up. No kidding. Please add your logbook up. Please make sure that the hours you put on the IACRA form match the ones in your logbook as closely as possible, and make sure that this is a tough one for private. If I'm doing a private check ride, the hours that you have for training time plus the hours that you have for solo time should actually add up to total time, right? Does that equation look like it ought to work?
Yeah, I think so.
I have probably 1 out of 5 that That's not it. That doesn't add up. So now we have to go back through, try to find that. And I used to help go through. I don't do that anymore. I usually have other people waiting because I do 2 of these a day when I come. And so it's not my job to find the hours in a person's logbook. That's the flight instructor's job and, whoever else is doing quality control on this. And so the hours aren't added up. There are not enough of them. Maybe the cross country didn't go to the right location. It wasn't long enough. Maybe they don't have enough takeoffs and landings in the various categories. Maybe they don't have 3 hours in the preceding 2 calendar months of the test. Let's see, what else could possibly go wrong here? Endorsements aren't correct. The challenge I see with this, and I'm not blaming anybody, I'm just thinking, and I have been thinking for the last year, what would be helpful? And so, Tim, I want you to help me get my act together and get that website up. And my goal is to put that information on there free to the public to tune in, look at, and walk through how to not fall in these potholes. And I have been doing this now for 40 years of instructing and teaching people, longer than that, actually. I have made every mistake there is to make. It's very seldom that I see one that I haven't made yet. And so I can help them avoid those potholes. But what happens there is we can't get it fixed in time, or we can't get it fixed at all. The person who endorsed it and didn't do it right is now flying in the Bahamas, and there's nothing I can do. Or if the airplane won't qualify. That's another big one. The airplane, I had one recently that the ADs, we could not find the ADs that were recurring for, the airplane. And if it's a Cessna 172 from previous, if it hasn't done the retrofit on the seat rails, then that's
Yes.
going to be a 100-hour thing. And we couldn't find that, and it just breaks my heart for the applicant. That's not their fault. And the instructor then feels bad too, or should. And it's really tough to watch. But the test can't be given because we can't get it fixed. And the maintenance person isn't available, and we can't do it till next week to even look at it. Blah blah blah. And so those kinds of pieces have to be done correctly, and there has to be real focus on that. Now, as far as the students go, that old formula for every hour you fly, there should be 3 hours of study is still true, maybe more. And people aren't coming prepared. They're not studying, or they've hit a pause because they can't get an examiner. Excuse me. And so now they've got, they're trying to stay current, they're bored, things are going stale, their knowledge test is old. They got a 75 on it, and it's like, oh, man. And so my suggestion on that in particular, if you have someone who's scoring in the 70s, first of all, as flight instructors or as DPEs, those deficient items have to be covered
Right,
on the
right.
test.
It has to
That
be
is,
endorsed, doesn't it? It has to be say, when we
yes,
went over this topic, it should be in the logbook, right? Yeah, if I remember
yeah,
this right.
deficit areas have been covered,
Right, yeah.
but they need to be covered in a scenario manner. They can't just be rote memorized, because in the exam, it's all scenario.
Yeah,
I'm going to take
scenario-based
that
testing. Yeah.
information, yeah, and then I'm going to ask you to apply that to the situation I just gave you, and I want to listen to your answer. And that piece is hard if you're not practicing that on a daily basis with your flight instructor. So there's that. The other thing too with some of this with the students is, it's more fun to fly than it is to do the ground stuff. And so when they're working with their flight instructor and their flight instructor is going over the things, they're hearing, yeah, 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 got that, got that, got that, I got that. And then they get to me and no, they really didn't have that. And so and
Good.
and yeah, and so the study I had, and so my effort to help with mentoring in terms of paperwork will be coming to a viewing audience soon if you help me, because that piece you just don't know if you haven't got somebody who helps with that. And if you're a contract instructor on your own, or if you're a new flight school, or if nobody cares, and you're really it's hard to get any help. And if it goes sideways and then goes to the FAA without being caught, it will come back, and then it's going to bind everything up for weeks.
Right.
Does
So,
that over
so
answer that?
paperwork is one thing. So make sure that all the endorsements are done correctly, the IR
Or,
performance done correctly, hours
right.
are added up correctly.
Yeah.
Maintenance is properly documented. ADs, for example, that's another paper. That's technically paperwork. I'd like to
More
assume the
paperwork.
best intention that the maintenance team is actually doing the AD inspection. Whether it's, I think the Piper Cherokee has this battery for the ELT, is also another AD I've seen. Cessna, of course, is the seat back rail, whatever. That's a
See,
common one. And then I think Piper also has the wing spar one that's applicable to certain years. So
sure.
that's one. And then the last one is also, if I noticed you mentioned here too, if the endorsement isn't correct, you could technically fix it on the spot,
Mhm.
but the issue is the instructor's not present. So I think that's something that's interesting to hear. So like I've had actually a split. So in some of my check rides, I've had my instructor show up because he was really invested in my progress and he wanted to fly out with me, and he showed up, and we did the
Great.
checker together. And
Yay
another
for
one,
him and you.
that's Bob Meter and from NAFI. So shout out to National Association of Flight Instructors.
So you flew with Bob?
He's my CFI. Yeah.
He's your CFI? Oh,
He's my
how
CFI.
cool. Oh, yeah. You did good.
And then, but I've had another, and no offense to the previous CFIs and other check rides I've done too, but like, they say, okay, here's the maintenance log books. You give me a bucket to go to the other office and see, or go to the airport and see around. And I'm like, okay. And this is my private, for example. And had all the books. I flew out to the airport, had everything ready. But my CFI he was on call, but he was not like in the room or nearby. He was another building away. And I guess if the worst issue would happen, I could probably get him. But yeah, he wasn't really like just kind of hanging around.
Yeah.
I still, I still like my CFIs, but I think those are some good advice there. The ground knowledge. So let's take. I know we're kind of running out of time, but this is a really good topic. I think what are some common deficiency areas you see with students on the ground portion that they didn't
Okay.
really master? Like, is it weather? Is it regulations? Or what's the biggest fail point
Keep
for
going.
students?
Keep going.
I mean, I mentioned every single book in there. So regulation, weather, airspace is probably a common one, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Forms, icing. I mean,
Yes.
more for like instrument stuff, but I'm
Yes.
assuming that's kind of what the common pitfalls are. From your perspective, what do you commonly see from what, like, okay? And there's another thing too. So like a student maybe have some deficiency areas, but they're able to self-correct. At what point is it in the examiners, throughout the process, you're like, okay, you got way too many like this knowledge stuff wrong. We have to do a failure. At what point do you make that decision?
We're supposed to make it when it happens, something
Like critical, right?
outlandishly unsafe. I tend to see if there's a pattern in an area, and a lot of times what I'll do is kind of put a pin in it and say, okay. And sometimes people just can't remember, their own name even. They're so nervous. And so, I know everybody's going to be nervous as I'm nervous when I have to take these too. Nobody enjoys these. And so if it's something like that, they just went blank, then I'll just put it over here and put a circle around it. Say, I'm going to come back to that later. If you think about it, let me know. And so I'm hoping they're going to pass. My goal is that we get to go fly and finish it up and give them a certificate. But if I find an area where there are several things, and they can look things up and they don't have to know everything, they don't have to be perfect. And if I find an area, and a lot of times it's airspace and chart symbols, because they're using ForeFlight, and I have ForeFlight too, but if you don't understand the symbols and poking at them on the screen doesn't always give you the right answer.
You look at the
And
chart
so
legend.
and so cross country flying and diversions, because there's pilotage dead reckoning and all that, it is kind of a lost art. And that is required on the tests for both private and for the commercial. And so people need to find somebody who can teach that to them. And some instructors just refuse. I have people come that say their instructors don't teach ground. And I'm going, was that an option when you got a certificate? But that's the case. And they don't teach cross country anything other than get your ForeFlight out and punch some buttons. And the challenge with all that is that if you don't have the basics, if you don't have basic understanding of how this works, ForeFlight, when it fails, isn't going to help you. And if you don't know how to find some destination just with a chart and looking out the window, it may be a bad day and you're going to run out of fuel perhaps. And so there are real reasons for these things and that are often overlooked. But That's one. It's overlooked on the ground, and then finding the destination. Sometimes we miss it by 5 miles, and that won't work if you're trying to find somewhere in four corners and you're going to run out of gas. And so that piece of steep turns tend to be kind of an issue.
That's in the
And
fine portion, yeah.
yeah, in the flying portion. On the ground, it's basically some of the regulations, especially at the instrument Checkride, the fuel requirements, the alternate requirements, the weather. I'm finding really light information on weather briefings, how to get one. Everybody's using ForeFlight. I find few people that have even talked to a briefer, let alone open a flight plan, let alone talk to flight service in the air, have no idea how to open or close a flight plan because they use flight following. Well, that's okay if you live in an area that has approach control, but a lot of us don't, and not everywhere can you get flight following. You don't have radar. You don't have Verizon on your phone. You can't get ForeFlight. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. And so having basic knowledge is an important thing from my perspective. You can do your check ride just using ForeFlight. You can use the EFB, but I'm interested in knowing how to figure out the real ground speed, because if you don't know the real ground speed, you may run out of gas on this trip, which is not only embarrassing but painful in many ways.
Yeah, no,
Does that
we don't
answer?
want that to happen. Yeah, oh yeah, that answers a lot. Last question. So we're a little over time here, but we'll ask the last question here is from the audience members. So this is a long one, but what they're asking is, so the general outlook of flight schools, they kind of pitch this mantra of zero to hero, get to the airlines. How do we kind of shift the culture to more general aviation? Whether it's just flying your own plane. How do we grow the aviation community? Is there incentives? He mentions incentives, gamification, bonuses, other thoughts. How do we get away from just like the time building and airline route, but how do we train that at a flight school level to get our students more involved with the aviation community? I think that's how I interpret the question, at least.
Okay. Well, and I wish I had a magic answer to that, because I would go spread my wand everywhere. But one of the things I would recommend people do is get involved with the Wings program. And the people go, the what? Well, the Wings program is the FAA Pilot Proficiency Program with the FAST team. So what's that? Well, that has some real value, because one thing it does is if you go to meetings and you network with other pilots, you actually have a chance to do a little hangar flying, build some camaraderie, find some people that have the same interests. And it also involves a safety meeting, which is a very important piece of this. And you can either do that at your flight school. People say, well, I want to be a DPE. Well, my suggestion as to how to get to be a DPE is to become a representative in the FAST team program. Be the one who does the meetings, be the one who knows the FAA, be the one that they know, because they're looking for people that they know and trust and know that you know your stuff and that you're low maintenance and you'll do the work. And so working through that program is helpful that way. But for students, there are so many advantages to that. You can get your flight review through the Wings program, and I make no money from the Wings program from my commercial here, but you can get your flight instructors can get their flight review through it. Students can get their flight review through it, which we have to have every 24 calendar months. And if you ever have an accident or an incident, and I can attest to this because I have had a couple of them that were called accidents, and one was called an incident that were mechanical. One of the first things they will ask you is, are you a Wings member? And it was interesting to me because the people that were asking me this were from the FAA that I've been working with for 15 years through 141 and so on.
Yeah.
And they asked that. And I said, yes, I'm a rep. Okay. Well, so what? Well, I played my rep card. If I was a Wings member, it showed I was a compliant airman. And if I was a compliant airman in the Wings program, there was a very good chance I would get remedial training if I had a violation, rather than getting a sanction, a violation, or a fine. I would much prefer that, and then it doesn't go on your record. And so remedial training means that you go to an experienced flight instructor that works for the FAA, and you do some stuff with them, and they sign you off. It's not hard. The other thing about it is there's this gigantic library of anything you'd ever want to know. in that wings program, and that is useful to flight instructors who want to enrich their students, have them watch an interactive weather video, for instance, where pictures are worth a million words. Oh, and there's just so much stuff that's involved with that, and it's free. It's a password and a username, and it's a free service. So more involvement with making learning fun that way, and bringing in speakers and interacting with people rather than an iPhone or an iPad. It is a wonderful way to develop skills that you're going to need in the cockpit as a team member on a crew.
Yep, there you go.
And that is a piece of this too. So I would encourage that. The other thing too is I ask instructors when they come to me for the CFI initial, why do you want to do this? What is your motivation to become a flight instructor? And if I don't hear an answer that makes sense, like, they might like this or they might want to teach somebody, if I hear I hate instructing, but I'm going to do this because I need the hours, my suggestion is there are other ways to do this and build hours. This is not what you want to do if you hate instructing or teaching people and you don't like people. This is not it. And so decisions about why you're doing this are important. And I've talked with people that by the time we finish the conversation, their answer is, well, I always wanted to be a musician. And their face lights up when they talk about that. But when they're talking about aviation, they're just hating it. Well,
Not
maybe,
good.
what does that tell you?
Yeah, it's not
and
good.
not everybody is meant to do this, as much as I'd like to think that. And, perhaps going out and recreationally flying and VFR and, looking at cool stuff on the weekends that's one thing. But if you're planning on jumping in a 600 mile an hour jet at 45,000 feet and boring toward an airport at, 700, you really need to think about whether you want to do this or not, and what skills it takes. And there are skills. I mean, you need to be able to plan. You need to be able to use English to talk to each other as a crew. You need to communicate,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
there are pieces of this that, if I want to, maybe I want to be a nuclear physicist or an opera singer. If you hear me sing, you'll know that was probably not in my wheelhouse.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't always get to do if we're not equipped to those things. And as flight instructors, I really think that we need to talk to our students more about why they're doing it and help them. Counseling is a lot of this, and working with other pilots, getting to know them. That's how you move forward in the industry. And so being willing to go to meetings and interact is a really important part of that. And one of the coolest things I've ever done is fly warbirds for the last 5 years. And to be able to fly a B-18 or a B-25, that only happens through networking, believe me. Because I
Yeah.
have never in my life, Jim, had anybody come up to me and say, "Oh, you look like a pilot."
I don't. I try not to. There's a joke where they say if you meet somebody, how do you know they're a pilot? And they said they'll tell you. Just because of that joke, I specifically try not to mention that I'm a pilot when I talk to people. But then eventually it does come in conversation. Like, what do you do for work? Oh, I do. I help flight schools. So like, what do you mean by flight schools? I'm like, no, pilot schools. Like, oh, you're a pilot. I'm like, yeah. It comes up naturally, but I try not to talk about it.
But the whole world changes when it does, right? I mean, you have
Yeah,
just been elevated off the floor because you're a pilot. Yeah, and it's a cool thing, and it's a great thing, and
it's a
if you love
privilege.
it,
Yeah.
it's privilege.
It's a privilege and it's an honor, and I think everyone that's in the aviation industry needs to have a passion for it, because it's if you don't have a passion for it, that's how accidents can happen. And we want we want instructors that really want to teach students. We want airline pilots that really love their job. They're not just doing it for their money or whatever. And that's what really I hope I bring into the industry is that we've helped train more pilots that are competent and passionate about their trade. So I'm going to wrap up here because I think we could talk for hours. I think we could talk for
I
hours
would
on
love
end.
talking with
We
you.
keep
Yes,
going
yeah.
out here. I think we had some questions in the audience. We answered those questions already. If you are a flight school owner, B2B business and aviation, or have anything to do with aviation, you want to hop on the podcast, feel free to give me a call, 314-804-1200. Message us at info@redruddermarketing.com. I'll try to get to you. If you're a flight school looking to grow your school, obviously check that email out over there. I'll give you kind of a last one out here, Mary. If people want to interact with you, maybe they're looking for a DPE at their school, how do they reach you? How do they contact you?
My email is the best, or you can text me at my phone number. I don't answer calls very much because I'm usually giving a practical test, and that's not something I'm able to do. But, an email or a text message, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. And I do travel all over the country, and I try to go places where people have their act together, I mean, I like it when people have their paperwork done and it doesn't stop the test, and the logbooks are in order for the airplane and the student. But I'm happy to help with that some too, to get everybody on the same page with that. But I love going different places and helping people, and it really bothers me when people are waiting a long time for this, and a long time is more than a month. And so when I go places, I usually stay for at least a week. I do 2 tests a day unless they're CFI initials, and I go home very tired. I leave the last day open for retests if necessary. Generally, I probably get 6 or 7 requests a week to go places, and so I don't schedule way in advance, and the weather has a lot to do with it. Part of why I'm able to do that is because where I live, it rains most of the time, so we don't do a lot of check rides during the winter, and so until about July, where I'm able to travel.
I guess a good question here. I know we're wrapping up. So if it's a bad weather day, do you typically like cancel the entire check ride, or you do like the oral portion first and then you can do continuance to the flight portion later, right?
Good question. Yeah, theoretically, we're not supposed to do the test unless we feel like we can finish it. I'm an optimist.
Yeah, okay. There you go.
And I've lived in the rain and low ceilings for many years, so my minimums are much lower than a lot of places perhaps, as far as what we can do and how much we can get done with 3,000 feet. But yeah, if it's a bad weather day, I also have a wonderful managing specialist. And as long as I get permission from her to do something out of the ordinary or that's, not quite expected, and she feels it's a safe choice for me, then I can do that. And she is one of those people who is so rare. She answers her cell phone, her personal cell phone, on the weekend. Now, sometimes if she's in church, she'll wait till she's out of church to call me back. But it's like, I am so fortunate. She is great to work with. And so my opportunities to get things done when I'm on location are remarkably open, and I can do all the tests. And so that's helpful too, because if one person drops off or whatever, or the weather's a little low for the private, the instrument can be jumping right in there, and we do that. So, lots of ways to work with this.
Awesome. So if they want to get in contact with you, email you, text you, the email is maryschuaviation@gmail.com. We have it on the screen over here. We're going to wrap up. So again, if you are a flight school owner and want to work with us, reach out to us, give us a call. It's been a pleasure, Mary, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. I'll see you all throughout the year anyway. So we'll see you again soon. Really appreciate all the audience members for participating and listening in. We'll be cutting up this into small clips and also putting it on YouTube, social media, and all that stuff. So till next time, we'll see you guys around. See ya.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you, Mary.